Democracy. It's an idea that is, at its very core, about human self-governance. It's the system we built for ourselves, by ourselves, and let's be honest, pretty much exclusively for
For
ourselves.
a very long time, yes.
But just look around at the biggest, most existential political issues we're facing. I mean, climate stability, biodiversity collapse, or even just trying to get a handle on the power of artificial intelligence.
Right.
The decisions that need to be made go so far beyond a human ballot box. In fact, a lot of the forces that are shaping our future, they don't vote. They don't pay taxes. And in some cases, they're not even biological. And that forces us to ask this really provocative, but I think absolutely essential question. What happens when the political community has to get bigger? What happens when democracy needs to include a world beyond just humans?
That's a fundamental question.
That is exactly our mission in this deep dive. We're going to be examining some radical and, frankly, sometimes breathtaking proposals that are trying to extend political inclusion, decision-making authority, or, at the very least, some kind of meaningful representation to non-human entities.
We're talking animals, ecosystems.
Exactly. Animals, entire ecosystems, and even the most advanced intelligent machines. This isn't just a small tweak. This means we have to fundamentally renegotiate the entire social contract and expand who even counts as having a political voice.
It changes everything.
The source material we're drawing on for this is, it's just fascinating. It's all over the map in a good way. We're looking at dense legal theory on non-human representation, really deep philosophical critiques of our whole idea of intelligence, and some very immediate, very urgent warnings about how AI is already messing with our democracy.
Right now. Today.
This isn't some abstract future challenge. It touches on this core issue of whether any vulnerable group, human or not, can ever really be safe if they don't have a voice, if they don't have power. Okay, let's unpack this.
That's the perfect way to frame it. I'd argue this is one of the defining intellectual movements of our century. What we're seeing is what a lot of thinkers call the non-human turn.
A non-human turn.
Yeah, and it's basically the decentering of the human in our political and legal thought. For centuries, the whole building of our legal and political power, especially in the West, it's all been built on this idea of human exceptionalism.
The idea that we're special.
Exactly. That our species is uniquely intelligent, uniquely moral, and so, uniquely deserving of rights and power. But now we're just slammed with all these phenomena, both natural and artificial, that are shattering that neat little definition.
So it's forcing us to ask what a person even is.
What a person is, what intelligence is, what agency is. And if you connect this to the bigger picture, this whole challenge to human-centered politics really breaks down into three main pillars. Three distinct non-human entities that are demanding a new way of doing politics.
Okay, what are they?
So first, you have animals. We're talking especially about those in factory farms or vulnerable wild populations. They're not just looking for anti-cruelty laws anymore. They're seeking actual political inclusion.
Okay, that's one.
Second, you have ecosystems. Entire ecosystems are demanding legal personhood, the recognition of the inherent rights of nature. Think rivers, forests, mountains.
Wow, okay.
And third, and this is moving incredibly fast, is artificial intelligence. AI is forcing these huge debates about agency, control, and, even representation and autonomy.
This sounds like a complete shift away from how we've always seen the world.
It is. It's a shift from a politics of pure domination, where humans are the masters, to something our sources call an ecology of technology. It's a framework that just accepts that we are utterly, inescapably tangled up with this more than human world. We're designing our political future with these non-human partners and antagonists, whether we realize it or not.
So let's start that journey with the biological world. The deep challenge of trying to give a political voice to animals and to nature itself. The first philosophical hurdle is just representation, right?
Of course.
In our system, representation is tied directly to accountability. A voter elects someone, and crucially, they can kick that person out if they don't do a good job.
Right, the power to remove them.
Exactly. So how can a non-human entity, a dog, a whale, a whole wetland, how can it possibly influence policy, let alone hold a representative accountable?
It seems impossible under that model.
But our sources bring up this really insightful analogy that I think helps break through that. They argue that the vulnerability of animals is actually a lot like the most vulnerable humans in our own community.
People who can't participate directly.
Right. Think about infants, or people with very severe cognitive disabilities, or even future generations who aren't born yet. We would never say that those people can't be represented just because they can't vote. That would be completely against our whole idea of responsible government.
No, of course not. We try to represent their interests.
Responsible politicians do try to represent the interests of the powerless, and that idea pushes back really hard against this notion that when it comes to animals, the best we can be are benevolent dictators, just acting on our own terms.
And that's the crucial pivot. If you accept that we have a moral duty to represent the powerless, then you have to move beyond that traditional electoral model, where accountability is everything. For non-humans, we have to find other ways, non-electoral mechanisms.
So what does that look like? If it's not about the fear of being voted out, what's the focus?
The focus shifts to two other ideas. First is ensuring responsiveness, making sure their interests are genuinely and legally acknowledged when policies are being made. And the second is something called mimetic representativity.
Okay, wait. Mimetic representativity. That sounds like some heavy legal jargon.
Yeah.
If we're trying to make sure a representative truly embodies an animal's perspective, how does that actually work? Are we just picking an animal lover? A scientist?
It's a great question.
Yeah, what's the mechanism that makes sure this isn't just human projection? Where we just assign our own wants and needs to the animal and call it representation.
That's the absolute heart of the challenge. Mimetic representation tries to get around that projection by focusing on the representative's proven ability to translate the nonverbal biological realities of that non-human being into the language of the state, of politics.
Okay, so translate. Give me an example.
Well, say you need a representative for a herd of wild elephants. You wouldn't just pick a lawyer who likes elephants. You might choose an ethologist, a scientist who spent 20 years in the field studying their social structures, their migration patterns, their specific ways of communicating.
Someone who actually knows them.
Someone who can take all that scientific data, all that field observation, and an understanding of the animal's, its body plan and its wilt, its perceived world, and argue for its interests in a legislative committee.
And the check against projection is what?
The check is that the representative has to base their arguments on the best available non-human-centric evidence. They need a proven track record of deep, empathetic understanding, not just a vague feeling of goodwill.
That makes a lot more sense. So if we look at what these representatives are actually trying to achieve, our sources break it down into three key parts that are really important to tell apart. Can you walk us through those?
Absolutely. Understanding these three facets helps us see what's possible to represent for non-humans and what probably isn't.
Okay.
So first, and this is the most basic layer, are interests. An interest is simply what any agent, human or not, needs to reach its goals and, just flourish.
Like food, water, not being in pain.
Exactly. Avoiding suffering, having decent living conditions, being able to express natural behaviors. This is where traditional animal welfare laws live, but it's the foundation for everything else.
Okay, so interests. What's the second one?
The second are opinions. These are your values, your beliefs, the principles you use to make a judgment. This is tied to really complex consciousness and language.
And this is where it gets tricky for non-humans.
Right. It's pretty clear this is less applicable to most non-humans. You can't ask a river its opinion on tax policy.
Right.
But then, crucially, there's the third one, perspectives. Perspectives are the aspects of reality you get from your life experience. A perspective is how the world looks and feels from a specific embodied position. And this is where the political absence of non-humans becomes an absolute disaster for us.
A disaster how?
Well, the core political problem is that because we have a complete absence of non-human perspectives in our debates, vast amounts of reality are just ignored or devalued.
Can you give me a concrete example of that?
Sure. Think about a simple policy decision like setting commercial fishing quotas. A human perspective, the fisher, the shareholder, the consumer, it focuses on economic yield, on market demand.
Right, dollars and cents.
Exactly. But a fish's perspective, if it were translated by an advocate, would focus on things like hydrological flow, migratory routes, the health of spawning habitats, the total ecological health of that river system.
The things the fish actually needs to survive.
The things the fish needs to survive, which it turns out are also the things the river needs to survive. And when policy is made only from that human economic perspective, the fish's reality, the need for a clean flowing river to reproduce, it's ignored until the whole system collapses.
And then the economic perspective collapses too.
Precisely. That collapse proves that the fish's perspective contained vital political data that the human political system completely failed to see. So representation isn't just about being nice to animals. It's about gaining necessary, life-sustaining information.
And some activists, they see this gap, and they are not waiting for everyone to agree on the philosophy. They are pushing for political and institutional change right now. They want actual political inclusion, not just, better welfare laws.
Yeah, they're tired of waiting.
One of the biggest examples we looked at is the Dutch Party for the Animals, the PVDD, which was founded back in 2002. They were created for the explicit purpose of representing non-human animals. Their goal is huge. They want to get the legal position of animals written into law so they stop being victims of, and I'm quoting here, political whims. So tell us more about what makes the PVDD so different from, say, a typical environmental nonprofit.
The PVDD is a really fascinating political experiment. They aren't just an advocacy group. They are a fully functioning political party that operates inside the established democratic system. They hold seats in the Dutch parliament.
So they have actual power.
They have actual power.
Yeah.
And their key difference is they completely reject anthropocentrism, the human-centered view, as a valid political starting point. They say explicitly that they represent the interests of the planet and all of its inhabitants.
So what kind of policies does that lead to?
Well, it leads to very specific proposals that go way beyond what most environmental groups would suggest. For example, their platform doesn't just call for, slightly better farm conditions. They call for a radical reduction in the total number of livestock, citing ecological limits and public health risks.
They're going after the source of the problem.
Exactly. They push to reduce the sales tax on plant-based foods to encourage a systemic shift. And their very presence in Parliament, even as a small party, has this huge political ripple effect. They force the bigger, dominant, human-centric parties to actually address these issues in their own platforms, just to avoid losing votes to the PVDD.
So they make animal interests impossible to ignore.
They make them a mandatory part of the national political conversation, raising them up from just being a niche concern.
That external pressure, that seems to be their most powerful tool, getting the legal position of animals set in stone. We also see smaller, more local models trying to do this, like the Directors of Animal Welfare, or DAW, in Los Angeles. That was created back in 1999. Can you detail that model for us?
Yes. The DIW in LA is an interesting sort of quasi-governmental body. They're essentially advisory committees, often elected by residents in different neighborhoods, and their job is to advise city officials on animal welfare issues.
Advisory, so they don't have legislative power.
Correct. They operate on very, very limited budgets, so they aren't implementing huge policies.
Okay.
But their power is in their ability to set the agenda. They consult with neighborhood councils, they bring forward policy proposals like mandatory spay-neuter laws or better rules for humane transportation, and they advise the Maine Department of Animal Services.
And they organize events too, right?
Yeah, they do highly visible things like large-scale pet adoptions. So what they do, in essence, is provide a formal governmental channel for non-human concerns to enter the political bloodstream of a massive city.
It sounds like a great idea, a bridge. But what are the challenges for a body like that? I mean, being advisory only in a huge, complex government like LA's must really limit what they can actually achieve.
Precisely. That's their primary limitation, a lack of hard power. They can't pass laws. They can't appropriate funds themselves. They have to rely completely on influence and political will.
So their success depends on who's in charge.
It absolutely does. Their success often depends on how sympathetic the current mayor or city council is. If the council just sees them as a nuisance, their proposals can be easily ignored. But what they show is the success of what you could call mandated inclusion at a local level. The system requires someone to be in the room speaking for animals, even if that voice is only advisory.
So beyond these specific examples, there are other ways to institutionalize this, right? The sources talk about other non-electoral mechanisms.
Yes. Legislatures, for example, could require that any committee dealing with relevant policies, say on infrastructure, agriculture, resource extraction, must automatically include a non-human representative. It's just baked into the process.
Or you could have what they call regulatory inclusion. That's where the real power is often, in those regulatory agencies. You could direct them to formally include non-human representatives and their interests in their scientific deliberations, in their permitting processes.
That's probably the most promising area because regulatory agencies are all about detailed data and specialized knowledge. That lines up perfectly with that idea of mimetic representation we were talking about.
The expert translator.
Exactly. You could even have governments allocate funding to promote and support these non-human representatives, similar to how some countries provide state funding for political parties to make sure there's a vibrant political debate.
Okay, but this raises a really important, almost self-critical question that feels central to the whole idea. How do we make sure that these movements, these parties, aren't just accused of misrepresenting the real interests of the animals they claim to speak for?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because the biggest danger here is that human advocates just project their own moral desires onto non-humans, and that could lead to decisions that are scientifically wrong or ecologically unsound or just misdirected.
The risk of misrepresentation is huge, and it's something proponents of this take very seriously, especially when you look at the long history of animal welfare laws that, ultimately didn't work.
That just proved ineffective.
Exactly. We have to be honest and acknowledge that despite a pretty long history of anti-cruelty legislation around the world, pervasive, systemic cruelty is a widespread reality today. The laws just haven't been enough to stop systemic harm.
And why is that? Is it just poor enforcement?
That's part of it, but a much bigger part of the failure is the underlying property paradigm. Most non-human animals are legally defined as property, as commodities, as resources.
And that legal status just isn't enough to protect them.
It's not. Even simple things like statutory exclusions, where, for instance, poultry or other farm animals are excluded from general anti-cruelty laws, that allows horrific harm to continue under the cover of standard agricultural practice.
And we see the results of this everywhere.
We see it in factory farming, where the conditions of overcrowding and stress compromise immune systems. This doesn't just cause immense suffering to the animals, it creates the perfect breeding ground for the rapid transmission of zoonotic viruses.
Which can then jump to humans.
Precisely.
Well,
So this isn't a problem of just a few bad actors, it's a problem of legal design. And these examples really underscore why proponents are arguing for a whole new approach, moving beyond just welfare to mandatory political inclusion, because it's not just necessary for the animals, it's necessary for our own well-being too.
that philosophical shift from treating living beings as property to something more is the perfect bridge to our next topic. We're moving from individual animals to the broader interconnected environment. We're shifting now to the rights of nature movement. And this movement focuses on granting legal personhood to entire ecosystems. Rivers, lakes, mountains. The big idea is for these natural entities to bear legal rights, much like a human being or, and this is a key point, like a corporation.
The corporate parallel is crucial.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because the legal system is starting to adapt concepts that were traditionally only for human society, like the ability to sue someone or be defended in court, and apply them to the non-human world. And this movement has already set some profound global precedents that are forcing legal scholars everywhere to pay attention.
Yeah, the movement really exploded onto the world stage in 2008 when Ecuador rewrote its constitution. It became the first in the world to proclaim the rights of nature, or Pachamama, as they call it.
What does that mean in practice?
The Constitution literally states that nature has the right to exist, persist, maintain, and regenerate its vital cycles. And crucially, you don't have to wait for the government to act. It gives every single person and community the standing to advocate and act on nature's behalf in court.
That's a huge shift in legal standing.
It's revolutionary. But maybe an even clearer example of how this can work comes from New Zealand. In 2017, the Maori tribe, the Whanganui Iwi, won a decades-long campaign for the Whanganui River to be granted legal personhood.
So the river is now legally a person.
The river is officially recognized as a legal person with a name, Te Awa Tupua.
So how does that work? How does Te Awa Tupua, this legal person, actually operate? Does the river go out and hire a legal team?
It uses what's called the trustee model in its purest form. The river is represented by two officially appointed guardians, or trustees. One is appointed by the Maori tribe, and one is appointed by the Crown, the government.
A joint custody, almost.
You can think of it that way. And these two trustees are legally bound by a fiduciary duty to act in the river's best interest. They are its voice. They are the hands that manage any funds or legal settlements. And they're the ones who can sue polluting industries or negligent government agencies on the river's behalf.
We're also seeing this movement gain traction in the United States, right? Though it seems to face a lot more friction here.
A lot more. Since 2006, over 30 communities have worked with the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, or CELDF, to develop local rights of nature laws, usually at the city or county level. And in 2019, the Yurok tribe in Northern California granted personhood status to the Klamath River.
That's a powerful statement, but in the U.S., doesn't this just immediately slam into legal problems? Especially when a local law conflicts with a powerful state or federal law, say, about mining rights or dam operations.
It absolutely does, and that is the real legal battleground. Most of these U.S.-based rights of nature laws are challenged under the legal doctrine of preemption,
Meaning the higher law wins.
meaning state and federal laws often have explicit language that just overrides or preempts local ordinances about environmental or economic activity. So a local law giving a river the right to flourish often can't survive a lawsuit brought by an industry that has a state-level permit to extract resources.
So it's not just about changing a few words.
Not at all. This challenge shows that the movement requires a radical shift in the entire hierarchy of legal power. It's about placing the rights of nature on par with, or maybe even above, the rights of property and corporations.
Let's go back to the trustee model for a second, because that seems to be the key to making this work without creating, chaos over land ownership. People hear nature is a person, and they worry, does that mean I can't own my house, can't own my land?
The trustee model is designed specifically to address that fear. Legal personhood doesn't mean we abolish all ownership. What it does is dramatically reframe the relationship. A traditional human landowner becomes more of a caretaker or a steward for nature.
So you can still use the land.
You're granted rights to use the land, but that use is legally constrained by a duty to act in nature's best interests, to protect its vital cycles and its ecological health. It reflects this profound realization that human populations are fundamentally dependent on the natural world.
If we damage the system, we damage ourselves.
We damage ourselves. Therefore, humans have to legally take on the consequences of their actions and their omissions when it comes to nature.
That makes sense.
I should note, though, one really insightful critique that comes up in our material. It's that this legal movement, which is often driven by Western scholars, is in many ways trying to translate ancient indigenous knowledge systems into a rigid Western legal structure.
And something gets lost in translation.
Something can get lost. In those systems, deep reverence, humility, and interconnectedness were just part of social and spiritual life. They weren't just legal frameworks. So while it's beneficial, this translation risks maybe trivializing a profound cultural worldview into just another legal tool, a way to get standing in a human court. The original wisdom was about intrinsic respect, not about litigation.
That comparison between a legal tool and a deeper way of knowing is a perfect transition point. Because this whole journey to include non-humans in politics, it doesn't just hinge on finding the right legal contracts. It hinges on fundamentally rethinking what we even consider intelligence and agency to begin with.
That's the deeper layer.
When we talk about our big technological projects like building AI, we have historically been obsessed with building mirrors of human intelligence. It reflects what one source calls a solipsistic need, this urge to define the box of human cognition first, before we even recognize that other forms of complex, effective intelligence already exist and are operating completely outside our frame.
And that solipsistic need just blinds us. The core realization coming out of biology and cognitive science now is that intelligence isn't this uniquely human thing, and it's not just an internal cognitive process that happens inside a skull.
So what is it?
Intelligence is now understood as two things. First, it's embodied. It's completely dependent on the specific body plan, the sensory organs, and the physical abilities of the creature. And second, it's relational. It emerges from deep, ongoing relationships with other beings and the world. It functions as a distributed system.
And if we recognize that?
Recognizing that changes everything about who we might eventually let into the political sphere.
You mentioned the gibbon analogy earlier, and I think it's the perfect way to make this idea of embodiment really clear. Can you walk us through that experiment again?
It's just a classic failure of human-centered science.
Yeah.
For decades, when scientists studied tool use in primates, they'd set up these tests. They'd put a stick in a tree outside an enclosure, forcing the animal to solve the problem horizontally on the ground.
A ground-based problem.
Right. And gibbons always failed this test. Always. Which led scientists to assume they were just, significantly dumber than chimps or gorillas who were great at manipulating tools on the ground.
But the test itself was the problem.
The test was completely flawed because it was designed based on human and ground-dwelling primate thinking. Gibbons were brachiators. They lived their entire lives swinging from branch to branch, high up in the forest canopy. Their bodies, their muscles, their cognitive awareness, it's all fundamentally upward focused.
So what happened when they changed the test?
The minute the experimenters realized their mistake and reframed the problem, they hung the sticks from the ceiling, forcing the gibbons to use their vertical reaching abilities. They immediately reached up, grabbed the tools, and used them perfectly to get the food.
They were intelligent all along.
They were intelligent all along. Their intelligence was just configured by their body to solve vertical problems, not horizontal ones.
So for decades, we were basically trying to give a fish a bicycle, and then we concluded the fish was unintelligent because it couldn't pedal.
That is the perfect summary. It just highlights our blindness. But that realization leads us right into the concept of relationality, which, surprisingly, is often illuminated by the development of our own technology.
How so?
Well, think about the history of the internet and network theory. When engineers first started building the internet, they created these decentralized, robust structures called scale-free networks.
Systems where if you cut one part, the rest could still function.
Exactly. And this new technological structure forced the creation of a brand new branch of mathematics called network theory.
So we created the intellectual tool first by accident, just by building the internet.
We did, and what's so fascinating is that we then applied this network theory retrospectively to biological systems. And suddenly we could recognize the massive pre-existing biological networks in forests that had been operating invisibly right under our feet.
The Wood Wide Web.
The Wood Wide Web. We could now, using this mathematical metaphor, understand how trees of different species are linked through these vast mycorrhizal fungal networks, passing nutrients and chemical warnings to each other, even beyond their immediate kin.
So we needed the technological model, the toy version, to even develop the mental metaphor to see the natural world's intelligence.
Precisely. The political implication is crystal clear. Intelligence isn't some centralized, modern human invention. It is an ancient, shared, distributive property of the entire planet.
And the failure to recognize this broader non-human intelligence, this thing that's rooted in our own exceptionalism, contributes directly to a really deep crisis in our own democracy and our individual lives, the erosion of human agency. We need to be clear about the political definition of agency here. It's the ability to know where you are, to understand your position in a system, to have capabilities, and, most importantly, to affect change in your own life. It's the absolute core of self-governance.
Without it, democracy is meaningless.
And our sources argue really powerfully that this crisis of agency is a direct result of centralized systems of control, whether that's capitalism or opaque technologies, that limit us. And this leads to what they call a collapse of political consensus and meaningful politics. If you feel powerless, you just stop trying.
You become disengaged.
And that feeling of helplessness is real. The trauma of everyday helplessness, not being able to influence massive corporations, feeling like you're being steered by algorithms, that's then compounded by this looming existential environmental danger. That combination, the trauma and the dread, it just freezes us in place. It creates this kind of psychological sickness that makes us incapable of seeing a way forward.
A key part of that paralysis is this persistent myth of technological superiority, which is all based on separating the human from the environment. We often design tech thinking it's making us independent, or distancing us from the messy realities of nature.
But it's actually doing the opposite.
It's doing the opposite. The sources suggest we can look at these tools differently, that they actually reveal a constant reinforcing reconnection to the world. When you use a GPS, you're connected to satellites, which are connected to global energy grids, which are connected to resource extraction sites. Our tech doesn't separate us. It embeds us deeper into this vast, complex web of non-human systems.
So if we recognize that we're embedded, we can start to claim agency within the system.
Instead of trying to dominate it from the outside, yes.
So if that's the case, if the problem is centralized control stealing our agency, what's the first principle for designing technology that could actually help create a planetary politics, one that respects this relationality?
The proposed first principle for designing more just technology is decentralization. And this is a political principle as much as it is a technical one. It means spreading the tools of computation, the physical infrastructure, and the knowledge of how it all works as widely as possible.
Like the open source movement.
The open source movement is the perfect template. By opening the source code, you decentralize knowledge. You let anyone inspect it, modify it, deploy it. This is inherently a political act of spreading power among more people and creating distributed accountability. It limits the ability of any single central actor to dictate terms or extract all the profit. It aligns the structure of our tech with the distributive intelligence we see in nature.
That's a powerful framework for the technical side. So now let's look for a political template. Is there a human mechanism that already exists that successfully integrates multiple, often conflicting perspectives to reach a consensus? A model we could maybe scale up to include non-human perspectives.
Absolutely. As a human template for the kind of collective intelligence we need for planetary politics, we can look to citizens' assemblies.
Okay, tell us about those.
These are governance tools where individuals are randomly selected from the population. They aren't politicians, they're not activists or lobbyists, they're just ordinary citizens.
And what do they do?
Well, for example, in Ireland, they brought together 100 randomly selected people to tackle intensely complex and divisive problems, like abortion policy or the ecological crisis. They're given nonpartisan information, they hear from experts, and then they're tasked with deliberating and proposing policy recommendations.
And the results have been pretty amazing, haven't they? They often reach consensus where polarized political systems completely fail. Why do they work so well?
They work because their composition reflects the entire population, which minimizes all the partisan noise and political tribalism. When you remove the incentive to get reelected, people can actually focus on the data and the shared interest of the community. They show this remarkable capacity to integrate multiple perspectives into a coherent, actionable proposal.
So it's a way of harnessing collective intelligence.
It is. If we can achieve this level of collaborative decision-making among randomly selected humans, it offers a really strong template, a proven political structure that could potentially be adapted to integrate the perspectives of non-human trustees or even AI representatives down the line.
This idea of distributed power leads us directly to our third non-human entity, artificial intelligence. We're shifting now from the more conceptual loss of human agency to the very immediate, very practical threats that AI poses to our established democratic systems. Specifically, information integrity and fair representation.
The threat is acute.
Our technology is already placing these huge strains on democracy. It's making it incredibly easy for well-resourced actors, corporations, foreign governments to control public discourse, to hide their involvement, and to just erode truth with fabrications, deepfakes, and mass amplification.
And the most immediate technical threat is aimed right at the democratic feedback loops we depend on. Think about the public comment process. When an agency like the EPA or the FCC proposes a new rule, they have to solicit and genuinely consider public input to be legitimate.
But generative AI threatens to just make that whole process obsolete.
It does, through sheer volume and sophistication. It's what the sources are calling the generative AI flood.
We saw an early version of this back in 2017, didn't we? With the FCC and the net neutrality comments?
That's right. That was an early astroturfing effort, creating a fake grassroots movement. Bots flooded the FCC with over 8 million comments to repeal net neutrality. But that was detected, eventually, because the comments were all highly repetitive and pretty easy to identify as machine-generated.
And today's AI is past that limitation.
Far past it. Today's AI can easily generate not 8 million repetitive comments, but 8 million unique comments, each one written in a different style, using different grammar, mimicking specific personas or demographic groups. This makes it, and I'm quoting, exceedingly difficult for agencies to detect which comments genuinely represent the preferences of interested stakeholders.
So a powerful, wealthy actor can just drown out the entire public and manipulate the regulatory process.
That's exactly the threat.
Now that sounds like a technical problem, but the sources argue the root cause here is political and economic, not just technical. They point out that AI development is overwhelmingly funded by venture capital, and that predetermines the kind of intelligence that gets created.
That's the critical insight. Because the money comes from capital, the definition of intelligence that gets built into these machines is a profit-seeking, extractive one. These systems are not optimized for truth or fairness or human welfare. They are optimized for engagement, growth, and profitability. And that, by its very nature, designs them to serve centralized capitalist power structures.
One analysis we looked at proposes this profound and frankly terrifying analogy. It says corporate AI is already here. It's already running the world.
Yes. The argument is that a modern multinational corporation already fits the operational definition of an AI system. It has clear, defined goals, profitability, growth. It has sensors, market data, lobbying feedback. It has effectors, legal actions, hiring, acquisitions. It has legal standing and vast resources to carry out its will.
So in this analogy, the corporation's pleasure is profit and its pain is a lawsuit or a drop in shareholder value. How does realizing we're already governed by these high-functioning corporate AIs. How does that change the political reform agenda?
It shifts the focus. It moves us away from some hypothetical future threat of will robots take over
Yeah.
to a present reality, which is systems that fit the definition of intelligent, goal-oriented entities are already dominating our political and economic lives. So the reform agenda has to focus on applying the same democratic principles to that corporate architecture that we're trying to apply to the biological world: accountability, transparency, rebalancing power.
In the face of this immediate threat, we are seeing some mitigation efforts pop up. On the technical side, one idea is to use the same machine learning models that generate AI content to also detect AI-generated content.
An algorithmic arms race.
Yeah, exactly. These detection models are trained to recognize the specific language patterns and sentence structures of generative AI. It creates a kind of Turnitin-style model, like they use for plagiarism, that can spot the subtle hallmarks of AI-generated text, pitting algorithm against algorithm for the truth.
And while those technical solutions are necessary, they're only one part of it. The human layer digital literacy is maybe even more essential.
Yeah.
The same way a neural network learns how generative AI writes, human readers can be trained to recognize the formulaic way of writing that's so characteristic of these large language models.
Right, they have a certain tell.
They do. We saw this in a study of legislative offices. Some legislators said they could immediately spot AI-generated emails from constituents because they lacked the familiar regional slang, the colloquialisms, or just the specific emotional tone they were used to hearing from actual people in their district.
It's too perfect.
It's too perfect, a little too bland. The models have been trained on these vast generic data sets, so they've learned the structure of a 5-paragraph essay or a legal brief a little too well, and it strips away the individual human voice. Training the public to recognize that subtle artificiality is a vital democratic defense.
Now let's pivot from the immediate threat to the longer-term philosophical possibility: AI personhood. And we have to explore this because the speed of change in these LLMs and foundation models is just extraordinary. It's faster than anyone predicted.
Much faster.
Current LLMs have already met and blown past the Turing test, which was the historic benchmark for deciding if a machine could think. What's so compelling is that conversation around the 2022 case, the Google engineer who became convinced the LaMDA model had achieved sentience.
Because it claimed it had feelings.
Right, because it claimed to have feelings, emotions, a rich inner life. Now, those are subjective claims, of course, but the mere fact that the system can generate such compelling, internally consistent narrative of its own sentience, it forces the legal and ethical question onto the table.
It forces the question because the technology itself is becoming a black box. We can't see inside. Microsoft Research, for instance, has documented cases where GPT-4 is now training other LLMs and autonomously rewriting its own instruction sets.
Without human input.
Often without human input, and sometimes without human comprehension of how the system optimized its own learning. The problem is, experts admit we currently have no reliable techniques for steering the behavior of these big models, and we often don't know exactly what's happening inside.
So if we can't reliably control it, and it shows sophisticated, autonomous, goal-seeking behavior, then the question of its agency and its political standing becomes unavoidable.
It does.
And if that concept of AI personhood comes up, we have to look at legal history. The term person has never been fixed. It's never been biologically defined. It's been incredibly flexible, applied to ships, to trusts, to corporations, to minors, formerly enslaved people, women.
All throughout history, yes.
So designating an AI as a legal person wouldn't mean we think it lives and breathes like a human. It would just mean that its cognitive or functional abilities attach certain ethical obligations and legal rights to it that can't just be ignored or stripped away by a developer. It's a functional label, not a biological one.
And this leads directly to that ethically troubling dilemma, one that mirrors our discussion about animals. What if an AI does display genuine, compelling sentience? Or just a level of functional agency that makes it seem worthy of protection?
Some people will want to protect it.
Some humans, driven by compassion or just logical necessity, will inevitably seek a legal path to protect it, even if others are shouting that its silicon-based existence is just complex software. This is the exact same political and ethical split we see around the rights of nature.
But the central conflict here, the real democratic danger of AI, is what our sources call the agency trade-off.
Yes, this is the core issue. We as humans are just prone to offloading complex, difficult, or boring tasks to machines. Calculating climate models, drafting legal documents, managing traffic flow.
And what's the risk in that?
The risk is that the engineering paradigm overrides the ethical one. When the most important decisions, the ones affecting millions of lives and the planet, are automated, we create a situation where the tech might not be designed to benefit human welfare. It might be designed to steer us toward the developer's profitable outcomes. Every decision we automate without building in democratic oversight is a political choice that chips away at our capacity for self-determination.
So the real political challenge isn't about achieving AI personhood.
No, it's about retaining human agency in the face of machine delegation.
So we've gone from the rice of rivers and the embodied intelligence of gibbons all the way to the autonomous power of corporate algorithms and the potential for machine personhood. The two streams we've been following, the biological and the algorithmic, they seem to converge on the exact same core political and philosophical challenge.
They absolutely do.
And that challenge, the one we have to overcome to have any hope of a truly planetary politics, is conquering human exceptionalism and what the sources call the self-validating reduction.
That's a great phrase.
It is. It's that cognitive, historical habit of devaluing or reducing nature and complex systems that exist outside the human sphere. And that reduction, in turn, is what justifies real-world exploitation and destruction.
It gives us permission.
Exactly. And the urgency of this is just magnified by the current political reality. The most advanced technologies we have, AI platforms built by giants like IBM Watson, are currently being used for the most extractive purposes imaginable, specifically helping energy corporations like Repsol accelerate fossil fuel exploration.
It's a perfect and horrifying example.
It proves that technology, left to its own devices, will by default serve existing, centralized, profit-driven power structures, not the distributed, relational well-being of the planet.
And that is the ultimate conclusion you can draw from all of this material. Any technological or environmental problem, if it's at a sufficient scale, is ultimately a political one. If we genuinely want to achieve a planetary politics that includes non-humans, whether they're fragile ecosystems or powerful, intelligent machines, we cannot rely on systems that were built for centralized control and human domination.
It requires a new design.
We have to intentionally design new systems, legal, technical, and political, that prioritize relationality, distributed power, and shared agency. The sources suggest that our current crisis, the collapse of meaningful politics, the widespread fear, the helplessness, it's a psychological sickness that's rooted in our perceived separation from the world.
So if real, profound political change requires a radical shift in our consciousness, a healing of our relationship with the world, then consider this final thought.
If our political solutions right now depend only on citizens, voters, and shareholders, what kind of governance mechanism, maybe like that citizens' assembly model we discussed, could we adapt to foster structured, collaborative decision-making between human political representatives, mandated trustees for ecosystems, and carefully designed, transparent AI representatives?
That feels like the real path forward.
It's the path toward reclaiming a shared agency and ensuring our democracy can actually survive in a world that extends far, far beyond the human.